Good morning and welcome to the KDPG Sunday edition. I'm Stacy Smith. This past week was historic. It marked the 75th anniversary of the invasion of Normandy and the beginning of the end of Nazi domination of Europe. The end of World War II planted the seeds of an effort to form a union of European countries to prevent the seemingly never-ending wars and disputes. Those seeds first led in 1950 to the European Coal and Steel Community, consisting of 6 countries. And through various changes over the years, the European Union was created in 1993. It now has 28 members and has a goal of 4 freedoms for its Europeans: the movement of goods, services, people, and money. There is also the goal of a common currency, the euro. But reaching the goals of a unified Europe has not been easy, and now one of the key members, the United Kingdom, has voted to leave the Union. Adding to the problem for Britain and the EU is the failure of Britain to reach an agreement with the EU on the terms of their divorce, which has led current Prime Minister Theresa May to submit her resignation. And to help sort through what is happening and how it might affect the United States and perhaps even Pittsburgh is our guest for our first segment. J.J. Spoon is the director of the European Studies Center, associate professor of political science at the University of Pittsburgh. And here from the Post-Gazette is editorial page writer Joe Smito. JJ, thanks so much for being with us this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition. This summation I just gave of the European Union, it seems as if right now it is in a critical stage. Is it?
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you for having me. I think the European Union is at a critical moment. As you gave sort of the overview of the EU, we're seeing the EU has been in existence since the 1950s. In its current state with 28 members since the last member joined in 2013, Croatia. And I think right now the question over what will happen in the UK is really at a critical moment in terms of what that will look like for the European Union.
Can the European Union sustain itself without the United Kingdom in it?
I think so, yeah. As I said, there are 27 other countries. We have France, we have Germany, and Germany is the largest economy within the European Union. So I think so, and I think the real question is what that will look like.
Well, if the United Kingdom is not in the European Union, what does this mean for the United Kingdom then?
So I think that's the more critical question, because something that to keep in mind, the UK has been in the EU since 1973, and for that, over that 40 plus year period, you have sort of an entangling or an entanglement, one could say, of all of the treaties and laws and things like that. And so now the question is how to what that divorce looks like, and I think you used that term. And I think that's the real question right now is, and that's when we get into talking about Brexit, we talk about a soft Brexit, a hard Brexit, no deal, and sort of what that divorce will actually look like. And so I think that's the critical moment that we're at right now for the UK moving forward.
What are the big sticking points?
So I think right now the biggest sticking point, and one that we keep hearing about, is what's called the Irish backstop, which essentially is just the question over the Irish border, because that is the only border between the EU and the UK on the British Isles. And since 1998, since the Troubles were over, it's basically been a non-existent border. It's an open border. Goods, services, people can move back and forth.
Which was the goal of the European...
Which exactly was the goal, and you mentioned the 4 freedoms.
Right.
And that is exactly what we've seen now on that border. And so the question is does that become a hard border again? And that's what those that are called the hard Brexiteers would like to see, that becomes a hard border again.
Well, I think this also leads to with Brexit, in 2016, you had the United States electing Donald Trump. You had Brexit voted for in England, and we've also seen kind of a rise of nationalism in some of the other European countries. What's happening? Are there countries now, the people in those countries saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we don't want to have such an open border?
Yes, and so I think right now and this goes back to kind of that critical moment, and so there were elections in the European Union 2 weeks ago, and these were elections in all 28 member states to the legislature in the European Union, which is the European Parliament. And you saw an increase in support for what we call far right or radical right parties that are somewhere on the spectrum of what we call Eurosceptic, not necessarily in favor of their country leaving the EU, but are in favor of reforming from within. And so you saw an increase in support for these parties as well, of individuals not necessarily wanting France to leave or Germany to leave, but really to reform from within, and what that would look like would be weakening the EU from within. And so there really is, I think, over the last 3 years, in which some of these parties, for example in France, they were actually supporting a French France to leave, for example, but have seen over the last 3 years how difficult this has become and decided that what makes more sense is to get elected and then effectively try and reform and lessen the powers of the European Union from within the institutions.
Italy, for example, I think elected some members who aren't happy with what the EU is telling Italy about spending and debt.
Correct.
So are they just going to stand up to the EU? I mean, is that what you mean by reform from
Yeah,
within?
so both, so you have the League in Italy and the National Rally in France that both won their respective elections in France and in Italy. And really what they would like to do, and so they won, they got the most support among the population, and they have the most representation now from their respective countries in the EU. And so what they really want to do is to kind of whittle down the powers and of the EU from within. In other words, right, since the way the EU has worked is there is not a single constitution, but over time the EU has become more powerful, and what that means is sort of taking away powers from the nation states and giving it to the European Union. And what they would like to see is many of those powers over things, over economics, over trade, over immigration, to go back to the member states.
Let's go back to the United Kingdom for a second. If indeed, well, the Brexit was supposed to happen, what, on March 31? Now they pushed it all the way to the end of October because they can't seem to reach an agreement on how to pull themselves away from the European Union. Once they do, if they are successful in doing this by the end of October, what will the United Kingdom, what will Britain look like?
That's a very good question, and I think some of that really is, uncertain at the moment, depending on what that divorce would look like. So right now we're looking at October 31st for that date, that will happen, which now will become Brexit Day, and again, that could change and be pushed further ahead as well. And so what that will look like, again, will really depend on what the deal is that's struck between the UK and the EU, and why this is so uncertain at the moment is because Theresa May, who is the current Prime Minister, has stepped down from her leadership in the Tory party as of today, and by the end of July there will be a new Prime Minister. And that new Prime Minister is decided from within the party, and it could be Boris Johnson, for example, who is very much a hard Brexiteer, which has basically said we're leaving the EU regardless of what that deal looks like, which means they may leave with no deal, which basically what that means is that every single relationship that the EU has had in terms of laws, in terms of treaties with other countries will now have to be renegotiated. And that really is sort of the worst case scenario, because you have to undo basically 45 years of these relationships, and now the UK will be effectively treated as sort of a third country. So they will have to negotiate, just like the US has had to, with every single country, in terms of what those trade deals would look like, in terms of what those relationships would look like.
How has the uncertainty over Brexit affected investment in the UK already?
So I know, so it has very much affected investment in that there has been companies that have taken their investments out of the City of London in terms of physically their offices, their headquarters, and moved them to the continent. We've seen a lot of movement to Amsterdam, to Rotterdam.
Yeah, there was the chief financial headquarters of the world, but It's not the case anymore.
Exactly, and I think that just because of that uncertainty, we've seen the pound drop in terms of its value in comparison to the dollar, in comparison to the euro. So, and that's all just out of concern over what could happen. In other words, nothing's happened yet, but over the last 3 years, there's the concern over the potential of what could happen. And so that has really, I think, scared a lot of potential investors, a lot of businesses, and they've moved out and they've stayed away.
If this is a hard leave from the European Union, the President of the United States this past week said that the United States and Britain could make a phenomenal free trade deal arrangement. Can the United Kingdom do that? I mean, I know they can, but I mean, would it be good for them, or do they still need these ties with the rest of Europe?
So I think this is the question, right? The sort of go it alone or rely on the partnership of the EU. So, and I think they have the capability of doing that. But again, they've been so connected with the European Union for so long that it will take some time to really establish themselves as, again, sort of an independent negotiating entity. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that the UK has never been part of the euro. Right, so there's always been somewhat of that separation. So they've been in the European Union, but they've not been part of the Eurozone. And so in some ways that will make this perhaps a bit easier because they don't have the financial and the monetary issue to deal with.
Still, they have stayed with the pound.
They've stayed with the pound throughout, and so and there are a handful of other countries in the EU that have chosen not to be part of the euro. For example, Sweden and Denmark. But in terms of when we're talking about the size of a country, the financial importance of a country, you know, that the UK stands alone.
Who becomes the leader of the European Union if Britain exits?
So this is somewhat interesting in that the leadership of the European Union is somewhat diffuse, and so there are several leaders of the European Union. There's a leader. There's Jean-Claude Juncker, who's the head of the Commission, which is the executive. There's Donald Tusk, who's the head of the European Council, which represents the members. And those are all elected sort of from within the EU. And so currently the UK does not have any leadership within the European Union, other than the fact that it's a large country and so it has quite a bit of influence. Is
there any significance of Britain leaving the European Union on Pittsburgh?
So that's a very interesting question, and one that has been asked, that I've been asked, and I think so. Pittsburgh has quite a long history and a lot of ties with Europe more generally, both and currently in terms of economics, and anything that sort of will knock that, make that a bit more uncertain, could have some influence. We have very strong ties with the European Union. We're a very large trading partner of the EU. Pennsylvania is, and Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania is as well. So anything that's going to make that any less certain could affect us.
What happens to, once Brexit occurs, to UK residents in the EU and EU residents in the UK?
So that is one of the issues that are being negotiated, and that again is somewhat unclear. UK residents that are living on the continent in the EU now are no longer EU citizens, right? So part of this is, as you've mentioned, is part of the EU is free movement of persons, basically. And so with an EU passport, you as a British citizen could live and work anywhere in the EU. And now that's being called into question. And the question is, and this is part of what this deal will look like, will individuals from the UK now need a visa, for example, to travel, for long periods of time? Will they be able to work? Citizens, for example, that own homes in Southern Europe, how will that be affected? And that, again, is still somewhat unclear. For European citizens that are living and working in the UK, and some of that will have to do with be sort of industry specific. In other words, the industry and also employer specific. And if an employer, for example, would like to keep a resident of Denmark, for example, working in the UK, they will have to make the arrangements and perhaps pay for the work visa, just like an American that's working in the UK, and then that's all being funded by the employer.
We're a very quick answer on this one, if you can. Any chance that Britain will reverse itself on this?
Likely not, although there is always the chance for a second referendum. In other words, bringing it back to the people. I think that's highly unlikely, but it is a possibility.
J.J. Spoon, University of Pittsburgh, thanks so much for being with us this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition.